Welcome back to another episode of the Hustle Nation podcast. Today is a micro episode, and I want to talk to you about a subject I've become passionate about lately. And really, this conversation is about juxtaposing two words and something you also might start to think you're doing wrong. So let's talk about a scenario that I see all too often. Having a deep background in marketing and in sales, I've been in situations with small to medium sized businesses. And when I'm sitting in that chair and I'm attempting to sell my services, what is the first question you think I get? Or what is the most common question you think I get? Well, if you guessed it is what does it cost or what's the price, you'd be right. But people don't often use the word price, they use the word cost. And I think there's a big misconception, and I want to talk about that briefly. I think, and I've experienced this many times, is that people often see marketing, professional development, and sales training as a cost rather than an investment. And having sat in that seat and having talked to probably tens of thousands of businesses in my career, I found that if anything, that is both a mindset barrier and a productivity slash success barrier. So, what's my goal with all of this? Well, my goal is to get you to start to change your thoughts and your language and your feeling about the word cost or cost versus investment. And I say that because if you think more positively about the way you're spending, or in this case, investing your money, you feel better about it. You feel more optimistic, right? And when you attach both a thought and a feeling that are positive, it is more and more likely you're going to take positive action and you're going to have a positive outcome. So that's the goal of this today. Now, before we go any further, let's jump into the difference when we talk about these terms. When people talk about cost versus investment, we think of cost as money spent with no expectation that will have a return or a return on investment. The word investment, people feel and think money spent with the expectation of a positive return on investment or positive growth, right? Think of that like stocks. Now, I also want to talk about the feeling because so often when we use words or we're talking about marketing or sales, there's always a feeling attached to things. And the feeling that most people get with the word cost is burden, loss, stress, maybe even anxiety. Not a good thing, right? That is a lot of negative connotations attached to that word, unfortunately. Now, if we talk and compare this to the word investment, this word often feels empowering. It feels like planting a seed or planting a tree, something that's going to pay dividends or have a return on investment down the road. And we're talking the macro, the bigger picture, not the micro picture. And I want to compare that to cost because so often, cost, when we use that word and we're talking that way, we're thinking about short term gains. And as you can imagine, that's more in line with gambling than it is investing. Now, stark contrast there, no doubt. So, as we dig a little bit deeper into this conversation, I want to talk about why people tend to see marketing, training, professional development, these things as a cost. Number one, if we get down to the root of it, a lot of people are investing based on a need versus based on a want. And I say that because I've seen so often people go into seasonality with their business, or they've lost some employees, or sales are down, and they're reacting based on a need. And I call that the light switch theory, where all of a sudden we have to frantically change course, and that's not a good way to do business. So, what I talk about and what I think is so important is being strategic with business. And again, having been in this space for a very long time, I found that less than 10% of the businesses I talk to have a strategy. Now, I want to quantify that for a moment because I'm talking mostly about brick and mortar mom and pop shops, small businesses, and medium sized businesses. They operate without a strategy. And can you imagine what the outcome would be if a coach of a professional sports team showed up for a game, let alone a season, without a game plan, right? What is the expectation? Well, you should expect to fail and you should expect to get fired. So being strategic is really key. So if you're hiring any professional sales or any professional service and there is no strategy, either with them or without them, it is highly unlikely this isn't going to work, right? And so if you've done that before, you are probably a little leery about what the outcome could be. Now, I've also seen where companies have hired a fly by night company, and certainly that doesn't bode very well for your experience. Or you've hired someone that's made promises that they can't keep or can't fulfill. Or it could be that you've hired a company that's not capable of providing the services at the level of your expectations. That's not 100% on you. These things happen. It is a part of doing business, unfortunately. Hopefully, as you reflect back on that, this experience will help you vet these professional services or these professional companies in the future. Now, the next one I've seen skews more toward the medium sized companies, and that is a misalignment between marketing and sales or the business as a whole, like the C suite and marketing. And I say that because a lot of small businesses and medium sized businesses I've worked with, I've seen most of them operate in silos, meaning sales does their thing, HR lives in this silo and does their own thing, and then here's marketing over here. And none of them work cross functionally. They don't do a good job of communicating or working together internally. Now, a lot of that has to do with leadership, it has to do with lack of strategy, it has to do with a lot of things within the culture. And that can all be very easily changed, in my opinion. But having misalignment is one of the reasons why people say, we've tried this before, it didn't work, or we've done that, it didn't work. Well, you need to have cross functionality. You need to have communication amongst teams. They need to be able to collaborate and work together, not just once a year, once a quarter. We're talking about on a weekly basis at minimum. And the final thing I want to make a point of here is strategy is all for nothing. So you may say, Chris, well, we have a strategy. We do this strategic planning once a year. Well, that's all for nothing unless there's an implementation plan. Unless when you're doing these, quarterly offsites, so you're doing your monthly meetings and your monthly reports with the leadership team, if you're not talking about those strategies and where you're at in relation to achieving them, it's not a strategy. It's not much of a plan if it's not being used. And so I think there's a lot of things here at play as to maybe why things haven't worked. And so rather than pointing fingers, I think the best thing to do is talk about how can we change all of that? Because if you can take responsibility and you can prevent that, it is much more likely that any investment you make in professional development, in sales training, in marketing, in even a consultant is much more likely to have a positive return in the immediate future. And we're talking about months down the road, not years down the road here. Now, when talking about and mentioning strategy, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about how to create and utilize a strategy within your business. It's not just so important to be strategic or goal oriented, but more important to be consistent. And so, if you can break down some silos and you can get your team to start to work more cross functionally, there's a few things that you'll want to focus on moving forward. Now, number one, you should always have annual strategic planning. Number two, with that, we need to have an implementation plan. We need to talk about how and when we are going to achieve these goals. What are some of the actions and behaviors that'll be needed to get there? You'll need to ensure that there is consistency. So if you're meeting regularly to discuss these, bi-weekly or monthly is sufficient, you're good, right? And in those meetings, you'll be talking about the measurement of your ROI, the tracking of the goals and the reporting of the goals. Now, one thing here I want to mention with strategy that is really important before I move on is so often strategies don't work because they are too cumbersome. To go a little bit further, I've seen it because I've done this before where I've built strategies for clients that are 20 to 30 pages long, only to follow up in 6 months to find out that they're not being utilized. And so for me, strategy can become effective only when it is simplistic. Things work when they are easy, they don't work when they are complicated. And so if we can remove some of the fluff, some of the fat, and focus on only what's really important, because we can only have so many goals, right? And so part of this strategy being simplistic, most companies should only have 2 to 3 goals. Now you may say, Chris, we're in a big company, we're so much more capable. Sure, but if there are more goals, well, let's swap one out next quarter or 2 quarters from now, and let's focus only on what's important in the now. We can always adjust, we can always pivot, we can swap one out. Things change just like your business changes. And so, in the immediate, what needs to get fixed right now? Well, let's do those things. Let's keep it simple so that we can really accomplish things. But when you start to introduce more goals, more habits, more actions, more objectives, it just dilutes your efforts, it dilutes your focus. And so, what do you think is going to happen if it's more complex? And so, I'm being very serious when I say that many small companies should have a one-page strategy. If you're a small to medium sized company, maybe a two-page strategy. But your whole strategy shouldn't be more than 3 pages. If it takes more than 10 minutes to read or 15 minutes to read, it is way too much. And if you want to take action, we can only do it one step at a time. One of my biggest takeaways from this episode for you is just one thing at a time, one step at a time. Okay, so getting back to cost versus investment, I want to mention a few things to help you change that mindset, change your thoughts and your feelings about these words. Now, number one, when we're in these situations where we're considering or we're meeting with a sales rep, I want you to focus on long term results, not just immediate gains. Again, thinking about the micro versus the macro, it is unlikely that we're going to see immediate impact from almost anything we do, right? There are no quick fixes, there are no band aids. We need to be thinking and focused on long term. Long term is strategic, short term is the micro, is the light switchers, which is something we don't want to be. Number two, you want to think about and calculate the potential ROI if and when possible, right? It's hard to do, it's hard to quantify what is the outcome of X. And I understand that. But whether it's total revenue, team productivity, or customer engagement, what kind of impact might that have if you were to invest in this service, in this program, in this training? Number three, I want you to think about marketing, or in this case, sales, as development. And these, in my opinion, are essential growth tools, not optional expenses, but something that's, I don't want to use the word mandatory because it makes it feel forced, but these are things that you should be doing. These are things that big businesses that are successful want to do, and they do regularly. Now, number four, I want to talk about also using some different words. And it's no different than when we're parenting or talking to our children. It's like you get to go to camp, you get to go to a basketball training session, you get to go to a soccer camp, not I'm making you go. We get to do this. This is a great opportunity. Talk about that with positive words, positive energy, positive connotations, because you can trick your brain into believing, and you can start to believe that what you're doing is good. It is positive, right? And so, even the best of us need to have a bit of a shift with our mindset. And oftentimes, it all starts with our thoughts and the words that we choose. Okay, so as I wrap this episode up, you may be thinking, and some of you very well could have been through experiences that say, I've tried everything with marketing, I've tried everything with sales, and we just haven't had any luck. I'm not listening to you, Chris. I'm just not taking this advice. I want you to remember this, that just like any relationship, friendship, marriage, it takes two to tango. And oftentimes, we're only as good as the other person. And sometimes that other person is us. So we need to look at what can we do better to ensure a good working relationship. No different than with your team, your friends, your family. Is it communication? Is it promptness? Is it thoroughness? What else can we do? And those are questions we should be asking, an investment we're looking to make, whether it be in sales or marketing. Hey, how can I better serve you in this relationship? As we get this kick-started, what have you found that has prevented clients from being successful here? Or what have you found that are habits and behaviors of clients that have turned into major successes? What are some things we can do to help with that? Feedback hurts, right? But feedback is a gift. And so we need to look internally at what we can do to make sure we are our best selves, because sometimes we need to help these service providers help us, right? It's a two-way street. So moving forward, I just ask you to consider, how can you change your thinking? How can you flip the word cost to investment? And if it's not something you think or you believe is going to provide an ROI, it's not worth investing in. It's not a cost you want to take, because ultimately that is a cost on the balance sheet. And we don't want it to be a cost. We want it to be an ROI, one that we can't depreciate. We want that cost to yield more revenue. We want it to be positive on the balance sheet. And that is something you really must consider when talking and thinking this way, because all great leaders have a championship style mindset. So, as we move forward, always know that strategic investments in the right areas will yield returns that make a lasting impact. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode. We appreciate the ears. Peace.